Good evening. Welcome everyone to the first of what may be a series of meetings here. And yes, please join us. Come along. There's 1 or 2 seats left. Hello. Greetings. So, winning without war. War, what is it good for? Nothing. We would all, I'm sure, agree. But anyway, before we get too far along, let me introduce what we are here for, because someone might say, well, why? Why is tonight happening? And I would say, well, very simply, it's because we're at a precipice. We're faced with war that's impending. Yes, most of us in the room can see this, but can others outside see this? And can we wake them up to this? Well, in case there's any doubt about that, I would like to quote from someone far more informed than myself, and that's Viktor Orban, the president of Hungary, who I'm sure many of us will be familiar with, but he's just said this week, literally just a day or so ago, the train to hell is speeding without brakes and inexorably, and the engineer has gone mad. All we can do is jump off this train. He's speaking obviously about the plight of Hungary, and sadly he's far from alone, because other of his government, members of his government, in particular the First Minister, that's First Minister Szijjártó of Hungary, has said as follows: I can tell you frankly that we in Hungary are horrified by statements that threaten to escalate the war. I'm horrified by statements that EU or NATO member states might send troops to Ukraine. I'm horrified by statements about the possible use of nuclear weapons. And I'm also horrified by statements about the introduction of a compulsory conscription in Europe. One thing everyone can be sure of, as long as we govern Hungary, we will not allow a single Hungarian to be taken to the Ukrainian-Russian front. We protest in the strongest possible terms against the introduction of compulsory conscription in Europe. The point is that we know that our most favourite, recently unelected Prime Minister of this country, Rishi Sunak, has reintroduced the concept of national service, aka conscription, to the mindset of the man on the street. And so, going back to what the First Minister of Hungary has said himself, this is not make-believe, this is not hyperbole, this is not a group of conspiracy theorists who are just getting into a room and allowing their imaginations and theories to run away with themselves. This is real. It may not be that it's being promoted and publicised properly in the mainstream press. We'll come on to that. But it is real, and we are at this precipice. So anyhow, he has stated, this is the First Minister, no less, of Hungary, so Viktor Orban's colleague, and clearly a very well-informed man, far better informed than I, that we protest in the strongest possible terms against the introduction of compulsory conscription in Europe. We Hungarians want peace, and it is clear to us that the road to peace begins with an immediate ceasefire and continues with peace negotiations. Now, I would like to think anyone sensible with any wit or logic would agree heartily with that sentiment and would endorse that as the statement of a sensible and sober politician. However, of course, it seems like that is a rare voice in this corner of the world that we hear in the public sphere, at least. And so this is what we aim to rebalance. And more so than that, we wish to extinguish this imbalance to ensure that the public and all those that are as awake as we are then enabled to go forward and challenge elected and unelected or yet to be elected or prospective representatives, MPs, councillors, be what they are, be that as it may, any and all of them, and the parties that they may or may not represent be challenged as well on this issue. Where do they stand? Do they stand with us? Do they actually accept that war is on the horizon and that this is something that we need to seek to prevent? Or is it something which they are absolutely fine with? Do they agree with conscription, or do they oppose it? Do they oppose peace negotiations, or do, as we say, they should? Do they support peace and truces where necessary, without being specific to specific spheres of military conflict that might be ongoing at the moment, or indeed may be about to expand? And that's another issue. We know that the war is expanding. There can hardly be any doubt about that. So again, this is not hyperbole. To finish off, statement by the Hungarian First Minister, and this sums it up as far as I'm concerned where we are at the moment, particularly with NATO. He says as follows: the most dangerous things are happening in NATO. European leaders are unable to admit their strategy has led to failure, because the question will be raised, who is responsible for this strategy of failure? European leaders are looking for escalation just to avoid being held responsible. Now that bears repeating. And this is the first minister of a significant European country saying this. European leaders are looking for escalation just to avoid being held responsible. And I suspect he's right. What an alarming situation we face. But it is for us because, and I'll come to this next, our overlauded and overrated mainstream press are not doing the job for us. It's for us to get the word out and to publicise this situation if we're to have any chance of rectifying or re-diverting it away from the course it's heading on. Now, I know that we may have a number of speakers to follow, and I'll hopefully introduce as many of them as are able to be with us. But that said, before we get there, I thought I'd look at what the press has been up to. And now I'm in a room of fellow believers and fellow truth seekers, so I'm sure it won't take much encouragement to reach an interpretation about these headlines as I've reached. But one of them that I thought was particularly engaging is Camilla's tears for D-Day hero. Have a good look at that, yes. Does this remind anyone of the infamous COVID era adverts? How can you look into her eyes? We remember that, yes. So the propaganda is in full steam here. And we've got not just Camilla being wheeled out, but we have obviously in the sun the troops and the military being used for full effect. It's almost impossible to grasp the courage it would have taken to run into the fury of battle that day. And of course, it's an appeal to the emotions, as it always is. And I'll be frank, to my mind, this is just propaganda. And so, of course, we have Prince William. Is he a prince? What is he? Well, who knows? But anyway, he's in our press, and he's telling us all about this, and he's encouraging the propaganda. We have the Telegraph in the footsteps of heroes. So we've got, they did not flinch. And we might remember that scene from D-Day. And so it's evocative. And of course, it's trying to prime our young people for this next phase. So the 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds, and get them ready, of course, for what might be otherwise coming. And this is what we need to fight against. People say, well, we're here for peace, so why should you be fighting against anything? Well, we're fighting back against this wave of propaganda. And that's the point that I'm making. And of course, you really see it when you're confronted with the endless mainstream products of propaganda that we all know too well, especially here, those of us that are awake in this room, remember them. Well, yes, we do, but the problem is that those who were there, they remember, if they're still alive, what they went through, and they see the state of this country now, and then they realise that they were lied to. Now, I know that. I'm not going to be lied to, and I'm not going to be sent into that situation. I dare say most of us in this room won't either, but of course we don't want to see our brothers and sisters, but more importantly, our daughters, our sons, our grandchildren sent to a war that it would appear is senseless, is avoidable, and is to no benefit, certainly in this country. So those are my thoughts at this stage. Just if anyone's been able to hear me over the mic, but I very much appreciate we've got some amplification. It's either too much or too little.
I'd like to begin by thanking Robert for such an interesting talk and for introducing us to the way that the media is going. And the word propaganda was one that he talked about, and that's something that we'll talk about in a little bit. I was talking to somebody today who was talking about the 5 generations of warfare, and he said the 5th generation of warfare is very extensively focused on propaganda and the control of people's minds. So what Robert was saying was very much in tune with this 5th generation of warfare, the 4th generation being drones and the like, and the 3rd generation being more conventional military weaponry. Now, Robert explained why we're here today, with the prospect of looming war across Europe and maybe beyond Europe as well. Why am I here to talk about this? And I would say for 2 reasons. One is, like I think everybody in the room, I'm something of an information junkie. I love looking at information, as I'm sure everybody here does, and trying to discern exactly what's happening. So we're all in that together, not just looking at the present, but looking back at the past and trying to learn the lessons of history. But I'm here for a second reason, and I will pick up on that first thread in a little bit. But the second reason is that if I reflect on my own life, I come from a family in which 5 members fought in the Second World War. And that's my father and his 2 brothers, and my mother and her 2 brothers. That's 5. And I ought to add that my mother, who was a concert pianist, did her bit for the war effort, because she, as a concert pianist, played in about 1,000 army bases and munitions factories. And she thought that bringing art to such a dirty business as war might have some kind of healing effect. But if I focus on the males for a moment, and my mother's 2 brothers, one of those brothers signed up earlier than he needed to be. He'd already, by the age of 19, obtained his LLB, his legal qualification. That's really quite exceptional, by the age of 19. And he signed up to the RAF, and he was sent off to Canada for his flight training. And he never returned from Canada. He died in a training exercise up in the air, and he's buried in Ontario on his own, away from the rest of his family, and I've never met him. And when I reflect on a young life with so much talent that's been lost, it pulls at one's heartstrings, doesn't it, really, when you reflect on this. So these are the reasons that I'm personally here tonight. My back isn't that wonderful, so I'm going to retire to a chair and just continue by looking at what we can learn from the past and also from the present. And if I just pick up on the present, and Robert's already talked us through this quite extensively, I think we all know, well, how can we avoid knowing, that there's a snap election has been called on the 4th of July. And of course we're all asking ourselves why. You know, normally there's a long lead up, you know, why has this been called so quickly? And as Robert so eloquently told us, the hounds of war are baying already. And if we just pick up on the voices over here in Britain, we've got Sir Keir Starmer in the last week standing up in a dark suit with dark-rimmed glasses, telling us that national security is the most important issue of our time. Is that a sentiment we would all agree with? That national security? Are we in danger in Britain here? And then we have the voice of Andrew Bridgen, who many in this room will know, and many listening into this will, of course, know. And in a recent video, he stated that Sir Keir Starmer announced that Labour will go into a defence pact with the European Union. And according to Bridgen, there is only one such defence pact, the European Defence and Security Union. And Bridgen went on to say that joining that will give the European Union full control of Britain's army, air force, MI5, MI6, GCHQ, and last but by no means least, Britain's Defence Force. And he went on to say that the EU is already selling war bonds for war against Russia. So this is very much in the nature of a fait accompli, I think. And Bridgen actually said on the video I was listening to that he'd had a conversation with the ambassador from Russia who said that Britain was already at war with Russia. This is not something that we're getting from the mainstream media currently. And then, as Robert said, there are strong voices coming out of Hungary. And those voices are very strongly against the prospect of war. And Orban, as Robert told us just last month, told us that the West was moving ever closer to war every week with Russia. And Orban calls this a crazy mission. A crazy mission. And he attacked NATO, verbally, I have to add, by saying that instead of taking a defensive stance, which he suggested was NATO's mission, they were actually dragging EU member states into an offensive war. So, of course, this is very concerning, and it's the reason we're here tonight. We could all get swept up into a war so very easily. And here we are, just under 4 weeks away from a general election, and we'll come to that in a little while. So, what do we learn from the lessons of history about war? There's a lot of warmongering going on. Is this something we should welcome? Well, let's go back to the Great War, so-called, the not-so-great war, in fact, the First World War, which created 40 million casualties. And that was made up of 9 million men who were killed in combat, 21 million men who were wounded in combat, and I don't mean to shock, but many of those men were left without arms, legs, noses, and genitals. And around about 10 million civilians were also killed in the Great War. What was the purpose of this Great War? We're hearing a lot of talk at the moment about war. What purpose does war serve? Well, if we just look at the First World War, I think we can identify at least four reasons for this. And the first I discovered from a book which you can see on the screen, if you can see that. It's written by 2 authors, Jim Doherty and McGregor, written 2013. It's called The Secret Origins of the First World War. And some of you may be familiar with this book. And they write that the wife of the Prime Minister who took this country into the Great War, Asquith, Margot Asquith, the wife, had a controlling interest in Nobel Dynamite Trust, an armaments company. Is that a conflict of interest? Well, if it was not called out. So that may be one factor. I'll leave it to Doherty and McGregor to paint the second factor. And these are their words in this not uncontroversial book. This is what they say, and this is basically the thesis of their whole book. They say, a small, socially advantaged group of English race patriots, backed by powerful industrialists and financiers in Britain and the US, caused World War I. I'll just say that again. A small group of English race patriots backed by powerful industrialists and financiers in Britain and the US caused World War I. Their objective being, in their words, to destroy Germany and take control of the world. Now that would not have been announced in any of the papers that Robert talked about, but they find evidence in their book, massive evidence for that view. And here's another view as to the purposes of war, and it comes from a journalist writing a few years after Doherty and McGregor, Brian Friedenborg, and I'm just going to quote directly his words. He says that the war was ruinous for all the major players, and still they perpetuated it. And when confronted with a range of options, the belligerents often chose a horrible option when there were better ones available. And they often doubled down on the same or similar decisions, despite repeated failure, continuing stalemate, and appalling loss of life. Insanity, he says, describes the nature of World War I. So there's his view, that the war was a manifestation of insane behaviour, summed up in photos like this. But could there be a fourth reason behind the war? Could it have been malign design rather than insanity, for example? Could there have been a drive to actually depopulate? And one of our speakers this evening will put forward that view, as outrageous as though it may sound. And, well, certainly if we listen to the words of Wilfred Owen, war poet, who died in the First World War at the age of 25, then it's abominable beyond all imagining. I'm just going to share with you words that many of you will know, I'm sure. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gurgling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children, ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. How wonderful it is to die for the country. And in the preface to his collection of poems, it's clear he intended them as a warning to future generations. Again, I will quote his words directly. This book, he says, is not about heroes, nor is it about deeds or lands, nor anything about glory, honour, dominion or power, except war. Above all, this book is not concerned with poetry. The subject of it is war and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity. Yet these elegies are not to this generation. This is in no sense consolatory. No, the message may be to the next generation. All the poet can do today is to warn. So he presented the reality of war very much as a warning to future generations. And while he may have died at the tender age of 25, the bloom of youth, in action on the Western Front, he has left this incredible legacy and warning to the people in front of him in history. And the horrible, horrible irony of the fact that he died almost a week to the hour before the armistice came into effect, and his mother received notification of his death on Armistice Day itself, as her local church bells were ringing in celebration. We can only feel immense pity for his mother, and of course the mothers of all those sons who lost their lives in that war. And that reminds me, if I go back to my own family story, that my mother used to tell me that she could still remember the feeling in her hand of the telegram that arrived telling her that her younger brother had died. And she would never forget, she told me, the feeling of that paper in her hand. The suffering that mothers and sisters go through is almost impossible to put into words. And here's another fact about armistice. A British baby born at exactly 11 a.m. on Armistice Day was christened Pax, peace. But at the age of 21, he would be killed in the next war. And the armistice was declared at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918. So that gives us 11, 11, 11. Why? Is this an obsession with the number 11? Is it a one-off? And, well, perhaps not a one-off. We have the 9/11 event in the Twin Towers, which is like a giant 11, and King Charles's coronation kicked off at 11 a.m, and the last state opening of Parliament started at 11:25 a.m. And the date of the next election has been set for the 4th of July, and if you add those two numbers again together, you arrive at the number 11 again. And so we're here tonight to issue a warning, rather like Wilfred Owen. We can keep trying to warn all our friends, relatives, family, and those we don't know. we can treat trying to warn them like Wilfred Owen about the horrors of war and how they very frequently serve no purpose at all for the mass of the people. I'll come back to that in a second. So we've a few weeks to go before the election on the 4th of July. And in that time, is it possible that we can warn people that the drums of war are beating? The mainstream parties are not revealing this fact at the moment, and all the mainstream parties would appear to be pro-war. That's based on a survey conducted very recently by Dr. Neil McRae. We'll hear him speak virtually in a few minutes. He wrote out to many members of Parliament and posed a series of questions to them. And one of them was, would they, if in power, would they dedicate billions of pounds to the war in Ukraine? And included in those surveys was the current leader of the Conservative Party, the current leader of the Liberal Democratic Party, and some Labour MPs, including Stephen Kinnock. And to a man and to a woman, because there were some females in there, they all said that yes, they would commit billions of pounds and more and resources to a war in Ukraine. And so that would appear to be the position of the mainstream parties, pro-war in other words. And I put it to you that if people do not want to put their children or spouses in the age group 18 to 50 at risk, is it worth considering whether you want to give a vote to those mainstream parties, or whether you might want perhaps to consider the merits of independent MPs who may or may not support violence, but who, by virtue of being independent, may be willing to think things through for themselves rather than follow a party whip. And we're talking about putting out warnings, and I just want to remind you of the words of 3 people, no more tonight, because time is relatively short tonight. We'll begin with the words of the much decorated Major General Smedley Butler, whose book, War is a Racket, is available free to read, and there's a campaign website, winningwithoutwar.org, on which you can find a free version of Smedley Butler's book. He didn't start out in life as a pacifist, clearly, because he was a major general. But he concluded, as a result of the many years he spent on the battlefield, that the profits of war are reckoned in dollars, and the losses of war are reckoned in the lives of the people. And we have a poster above the slide recording those all-important words, that the profits are in dollars and the losses are in lives. So the benefits impact the few, if you like, and the minus side, the losses, impact the many. It's not a balanced balance sheet, is it? And he goes on to say that the bill is shouldered by us, the public. And he goes on to actually specify the elements that this bill covers. Here are his words: newly placed gravestones, mangled bodies, shattered minds, broken hearts and homes, economic instability, depression and all its attendant miseries, and back-breaking taxation for generations and generations. So these were his words in 1935. And then, perhaps coincidentally, 2 years later, George Orwell, from these shores, wrote some very strong words. And of course, we remember George Orwell for many of his novels, perhaps most significantly 1984, in which Britain features as Airstrip 1, working in a totalitarian regime under, the guidance really isn't the right word, is it? Under the orders of Big Brother. And that country is at permanent war. War is a very good way of giving power to those at the top of societies, when those societies are not well intentioned. But in 1937, before he wrote, about 10 years, a little bit more than 10 years before he wrote 1984, he penned a book review. And in this book review, this is what he wrote about war. His words: "War against a foreign country only happens when the moneyed classes think they are going to profit from it." Echoes of Smedley Butler? He goes on, "Every war, when it comes, or before it comes, is represented not as a war, but as an act of self-defense against a homicidal maniac." That's perhaps a pattern we've seen in recent wars in the Middle East and in the former Yugoslav area. And then he says the essential job is to get people to recognize war propaganda when they see it. There he was, warning us in 1937 to beware the sort of propaganda that Robert so wisely brought to our attention, modern day propaganda. And Eisenhower, American president in the 1950s, these are his stirring words. "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket launched, signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone," he goes on to say. "It is also spending the sweat of its labourers, the genius of its scientists, and the hopes of its children." Are these the kind of words we're hearing coming out from our Western leaders today? Maybe in the eastern parts of Europe, as Robert told us earlier, but less so, if at all, in the western part of Europe. So there's a new campaign, and Robert referred to this, Winning Without War, with its website winningwithoutwar.org. And this proposes a strategy in the run-up to the election, and with the drumbeats of war there in the background, that between us, if we can grow, we need to put the issue on the pre-election agenda. We need to get this war issue, the prospect of war, widely discussed, not just amongst the people, but crucially amongst candidates. We, the people, need to know where candidates stand on the issue of war. Would they be prepared to commit young people of this country to war? And in asking those questions, remember, as Smedley Butler said, and as we learnt about Margot Asquith, that war benefits the few. And here's another possible strategy. We're going to have a discussion at the end of the evening, so see what you think. In key wards, in constituencies that you have links to, would it be worth considering sacrificing a day of your time to conduct exit polls? You could organise rotas so that you don't have to stand for long periods of time. But one of the benefits of these independent exit polls is that we would have some indication, some independent indication of people's voting behaviours. And another key, crucial part of the strategy is to get information out. Some of the warnings from Wilfred Owen and the others on the reality of war. Not the propaganda, the glorification of war, but the reality. and show that cries for war are actually cries coming from a position of weakness, not strength. Strong people try and resolve differences through strategies that are very specifically aimed at the specific and many and varied problems that would cause people to even think of going to war. There are other ways of solving problems. And a strong part of the strategy is that we need to protect our young men and young women. And remember this dramatic piece of art from Katie Kollwitz, never again. So I'd like to thank you for listening. I'd like to end on a positive note, because this campaign, Winning Without War, is a positive one. You know, we live in a wonderful world with some wonderful people. For example, all the people who've come here at the end of a busy week to join us here tonight. We live in a wonderful world with wonderful people. And there are so many ways of solving problems that don't involve the kind of horrors that we've seen people like Wilfred Owen experience and talk about. So thank you very much.